What's up guys, Ben from AM Cinematics here, and today I wanted to take a look at a film that I absolutely adore. A movie that doesn't get nearly the amount of recognition it deserves. That movie is... Now, I will be the first to admit that this movie has its flaws. Some of its characters, most of its characters are two-dimensional, and sometimes the writing is, well...
Stop! The world is bigger than this.
Bitch, please!
But all these things aside, I love this movie. I think it does almost everything right, because it isn't trying to do too much. And honestly, for a fun film like this, that works fine. Jordan Vogt Robert has such an attention to detail that every time I rewatch this film, I find something new that I didn't notice before. Like how he manages to create an engaging first scene without a single word of dialogue, or the brilliant choice of music throughout the film, or how they somehow managed to make a Vietnam aesthetic work perfectly with the King Kong movie. But one thing in particular that I really wanted to talk about was its world building. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, world building is the process of constructing an imaginary world, sometimes associated with a whole fictional universe. Developing an imaginary setting with coherent qualities such as a history, geography, and ecology is a key task for many science fiction or fantasy writers. And Kong Skull Island is an excellent example of a movie utilizing those elements of history, geography, and ecology as a way to create a believable world in which creatures like Godzilla and Kong could actually exist. Let's start by taking a look at the island itself. The reason why Skull Island looks so realistic is because the footage used for it is based off of actual locations in both northern Vietnam and parts of Oahu. Now don't get me wrong, green screens are awesome and can be used to create some fascinating settings, but when you use actual locations to create your settings, it makes for a more natural and beautiful looking environment. Plus, you tend to get better performances out of the actors, as there's something physically there for them to see and react to, as opposed to just looking at a big green sheet. And in this movie, you can really tell Jordan Vogt Roberts took the time to scope out different and unique settings, as I didn't even recognize any of the places on screen.
All the time in Hawaii and Australia, the actors consistently come up to me and they sort of say, "This is beautiful. This is one of the prettiest places I've ever seen." And I agree with them, but my perpetual response is, wait until we go to Vietnam. I've now spent kind of a month of my life scouting Vietnam, discovering it, falling in love with it, and the places there they're just spectacular.
In the first 30 minutes, the movie already establishes its setting and a detailed history of its origin. So we can go ahead and check off both history and geography from our world building checklist. However, the island itself would be nothing without its awesome inhabitants. Getting to see the different kinds of creatures prowling on Skull Island has always been a highlight of the Kong films for me personally, and they truly outdid themselves here. Watching as our protagonists stumble into these terrifying and sometimes gorgeous creatures helps create an unnerving atmosphere that reminds you that the outside world had no place being on this island. Almost every creature's design was based off of a real animal too. Everything from the massive skirt buffalo to the spore mantis. It created a beautiful blend of both science and myth. Also, I'd much rather a movie create its own unique monsters as opposed to just copy-pasting dinosaurs on the island and calling it a day. Don't get me wrong, dinosaurs are great, but it's nice to get some different monster designs sometimes. This is something that Monster Hunter World does especially well. However, no story is complete without its antagonist, the Skull Crawlers.
Never said that name out loud before. It sounds stupid now that I say it. Just, you call them whatever you want.
When I first watched the movie, I was kind of on the fence about the Skull Crawlers. I mean, they looked and sounded fine, but there really wasn't too much to them. But when I rewatched the movie, I noticed all these little details that I missed the first time. Like how they have eyeless faces and loose gray skin, making them resemble naked mole rats more than anything. But these design choices make sense when you realize that these creatures are said to have spent most of their time underground. The Skullcrawler's maniacal and cruel nature is perfectly expressed in their small and subtle mannerisms, and they make for a great villain for Kong to go up against. And honestly, it's nice seeing him take on something that isn't a T-Rex or planes.
Hey bro, watch your jet. Watch your jet, bro. Watch your jet!
I really hope we get to see these guys again in the new Godzilla Vs Kong film, and I'd love to see how Godzilla reacts to them, but that's just me, I guess. I also really like the approach they took when designing the indigenous population that lives on the island. The King Kong movies have a not so great history when it comes to how they portray native people.
Okay.
However, I think they handled it here perfectly. I'm totally on board with the idea that for once, instead of being portrayed as primitive savages, they're actually a more sophisticated society. While I wanted to know more about them and how they survive on the island, I think this is an excellent example of less being more, with the lack of a background or explanation of their origin making them all the more fascinating. The amazing practical effects and makeup also help to bring them alive. And I also like the fictional architecture they created, especially that really cool looking dam that worked off of some kind of pulley system. Things like this are the very definition of world building, and it leaves you wanting to learn more about that world. Although I seriously doubt that this flimsy ass wall could keep skull crawlers out, but let's just ignore that. And if we're talking about how good this movie is at world building, I wouldn't be doing it justice if I didn't talk about one character in particular.
Whoa. No need for that. Come on now. Everybody keep your wigs on now.
Marlowe. I know what you're thinking. We're talking about Skull Island and how it's good at world building. Why would we talk about him? Well, that's the beauty of his character. Marlowe's main function in the story, other than being comic relief, is that he serves as the main link between Skull Island and reality, being the only recognizable piece of humanity still living on the island. Marlowe's character also goes to show the power of visual storytelling, with entire pieces of his life story being told to us in just a few frames. I absolutely love details like this, because it teaches us about our characters without needing to say a single word. And as I'm sure you all know, it's much more impressive when a film can show you what it's thinking instead of outright telling you. But when there is dialogue, it is made all the more better by John C. Reilly's eccentric and brilliant performance, essentially being the soul of the film. While Marlowe is easily the best human character in the movie, there is still one more character that we still need to talk about. He's the star of the show, the one and only Kong. But first, I need to quickly address a question that I have seen literally everywhere. How is Kong the same height as Godzilla? I completely understand people's confusion with this, as Kong was always portrayed to be much smaller than Godzilla. Well, the short answer is, the Kong we see in Skull Island is not linked to any previous King Kong movies. This is a completely new iteration of the character that is made specifically for Warner Brothers' shared monsterverse, with the hopes that King Kong will later face off against Godzilla. And in Kong Skull Island, he's said to be around 104 feet tall. Not only that, but they also clearly state that he's just a juvenile that's still growing.
Kong's the last of his kind, but he's still growing.
Baby man, little baby man.
And seeing how Godzilla vs Kong takes place around 40 years later, he'll be fully grown and around the same height as Godzilla by then.
Damn. That's a big bitch.
Anyways, back to the video. This is by far my favorite on-screen version of Kong. Everything about him is oozing character, from the incredible motion capture performance by Terry Notary to his new renovated character design. You see, Jordan Vogt Roberts made a very clear creative choice to not represent Kong as a straight-up gorilla as he had been done so many times in the past, but instead as a completely new design that takes a more upright, humanoid-like stance. And if we're talking about how amazing Kong looks, I wouldn't be doing y'all justice if I didn't talk about the unbelievably talented visual effects teams behind this. Weta Digital and Industrial Light Magic later revealed in a behind-the-scenes video the process in which they created Kong. And honestly, it makes sense now as to why he looks so freaking amazing. One of the things they mentioned was that since Kong is essentially a monkey who can't speak, they didn't have the luxury of using dialogue to give him character. So in order to make sure he had a personality and identity, they put a heavy emphasis on things like his body movement and eyes. There was an entire team dedicated to utilizing his eyes alone and the ways they could be used to display different kinds of emotion. And it really shows in the final cut, with Kong having more depth than most of the human characters. And for source material, they actually got photos of a real-life silverback gorilla so they could get that extra amount of detail on his fur, hands, and facial structure. The sheer amount of work that went into bringing Kong to life is honestly jaw-dropping, and it makes that Oscar nomination for Best Visual Effects completely understandable. Something people often forget when thinking about world building is that the perspective in which we experience the story through is just as important as the people or things that occupy that said universe. How your protagonists coexist or act in the world can play a big role in our understanding of how that world works. And I really love the idea that for a lot of Kong Skull Island, we see the story through the perspective of Kong. We get to see how he spends his time hunting, relaxing, and fighting. I was not joking earlier when I said he has more depth than most of the human characters. Now, I'm definitely a hashtag Team Godzilla guy, But this is one of the things that this movie does much better than the other two Godzilla films. It actually lets the monsters take the center stage, as opposed to them being mere afterthoughts in their own movie. Sure, Godzilla King of the Monsters had more kaiju action, but they were still sidelined in a movie that's supposed to be about them. By giving Kong more screen time and attention, it actually strengthens the world building, as we get to not only know more about these kaiju and how they operate in this world, but we also get to learn how they respond to emotions like fear, anger, and loneliness. If there's one thing we should take away from this film as young aspiring world builders, it would be to observe how it brings to life the people, creatures, and locations that fill this fictional world. Now, should having an interesting world come at the cost of having well-developed characters? No, it really shouldn't. If anything, it should give you more opportunities as a writer to create compelling stories. That's why I'm so confused as to why franchises with such rich and fascinating lore continue just to retell the same old narratives, when there's an entire universe of options available. And yeah, Kong Skull Island is definitely formulaic and a bit predictable, but I can confidently say that for both monster and action films as a whole, it's a step in the right direction.